Hey everybody, this is from the Routledge International Handbook of Cosmopolitan Studies, second edition, edited by Gerard Delanty. It was published in 2019. So, the essay, let me get to the page, is titled World History and Cosmopolitanism by Stråth, Bostra with a little circle on top, TH. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Could be Bostrath is how you say it if you were just being dumb, but I suppose it's Stråth. My internet's not working, so don't have access to look it up right now, but I can read it. Alright, so here we go. I don't know what this is going to say or anything about this author or anything like that, but I want to know more about cosmopolitanism, and so I'm going to read about cosmopolitanism, and hopefully someone else finds it interesting too. Etymologically, the term cosmopolitan is derived from the Greek words cosmos and polis. Cosmos refers to the whole world, yes, indeed the whole universe, although in practice the reference is to the world as the globe. Polis is the label of a bounded political community, normally a small city-state. From there comes the term politics, the unification of the unbounded world, and the bounded polity means a contradiction, and the question in this chapter is how it has been addressed historically. The contradiction has been present in the historical discourses on cosmopolitanism since the 18th century. The cosmopolite has been seen as a citizen of the world, transcending political territorial borders, such as nation-states, and living in a vaguely discerned world-state. The cosmopolite was imagined as standing above or between all bounded polities. At the same time, the term had a local demarcation. Global went hand in hand with local. In the 19th century German debate, for instance, the cosmopolitan imagination was based on the idea of the nation-state. The historiography of the world of nations and the social issue. Immanuel Kant's idea that world government was a world federation of states rather than transcending states was ever more transformed into the idea of the nation as carrier of the universal. The discourse of Weltbürgertum was a point of reference in the Völkerrecht project of international laws, where the relationships between states was regulated. Global transnational society and interstate were two sides of the same coin that mutually constituted one another. The emphasis on the world as interstate or national incessantly counteracted attempts to transcend political borders. The major crisis in Europe at the beginning of the 1870s around the German-French conflict and extensive economic stagnation transformed the liberal dream and national as well as international politics during the following decades up to World War I. The emergence of protectionism in response to the economic depression clashed with the idea of establishing a common political and peaceful United States of Europe. Such ideas had been developed in the 1820s and 1830s, in particular by Henri de Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte. The general trend towards internationalism since the 1820s was carried by movements for peace, temperance, social progress, penal reforms, health, etc. It was a broad middle-class movement for peace and social progress based on the theories of Saint-Simon, Comte, and others. It was obviously an alternative trend to the speculative philosophy on the nation as carrier of the universal in the wake of Hegel and Fichte. In the 1870s, the trend narrowed down from large congresses and transnational activism to single-issue movements, constrained thematically, nationally, politically, religiously, or in the scope of specific social or practical sciences. This development was an important factor for the decline of the prospects of cosmopolitanism. Like Minerva's owl, a cadre of legal philosophers and professional lawyers launched against the backdrop of the violent German unification a project on international law in the early 1870s. Their liberal positivist ambition and pretension was to formulate laws in order to prevent wars or at least make them more humane. Their framework was the perception of a European civilization ordering the world in legal terms. Their cosmopolitan approach carried on the European basis. Their cosmopolitan approach carried on the European bias developed by Hegel. International law was an instrument of colonialism. Koskinimi, 2001. The international lawyers fought against the emergence of narrow nationalism. From the 1870s, the international/transnational trend since the 1820s faced an ever stronger nationalist language driven by campaigns for protectionism and the stronger attention to a social problem in the wake of economic deflationary pressures and unemployment. The talk was more about social protection in parallel to the economic protectionism than about social progression. The social issue never managed to take off from its national anchorage as Marx had hoped, but became one of the major factors behind nation-building and nationalist language during the last decades of the 19th century. Marx's identification of the state as an instrument of oppression of the workers and the social reformers' identification of the state as an instrument of change drove the language everywhere toward a national focus, irrespective of the rhetoric about transcending internationalism. The class struggle language clashed with romanticist as well as empirical conservative ideas of socially integrated nations based on the language of state socialism, as in Bismarck, or national socialism, as in Killen, Kjelle with an accent N. The overall impact of the clash was the cementation of the European nation-states. It is true that states made warfare and warfare made states. Tilley, 1990, during the decades preceding 1914. However, it is also true, although paid less attention to, that during the same period states also made warfare and welfare made states. Made welfare and welfare made states. National welfare was hand in hand with nationalistic warfare and mutual reinforcement paved the road to 1914. Stråth, 2016. The social issue blocked the road towards internationalism, transnationalism, and cosmopolitanism, and its connection to the ethnic and military issues made nationalism explosive. This was obvious at the latest in 1914, when the European working class movements, with few exceptions, were nationalized after the outbreak of the war in support of the war efforts of their respective governments. Friedrich Meinecke was a leading German historian who, during the years before World War I, wrestled with the romanticist conservative nation-state idea in confrontation with the cosmopolitan tradition. He built on the German debate between the Weltbürgertum and Nationalstaat since the late 18th century. The nation-state was, in the view of Meinecke, created by great personages, a view which well connected to thoughts formulated by Leopold von Ranke and Wilhelm von Humboldt about the nation-states as superpersonal configurations. In that view, Bismarck appears in Weltbürgertum und Nationalstaat as a successful synthesis of power and spirit, national unification, and universal divinity. Meinecke tapped onto a centenary philosophical and historical debate about German greatness through große Staatsmänner, who were the tool of God or reason. On the eve of World War I, when Meinecke wrote his book, the destructive potential of this view was not yet clear. But seen in retrospect, the attempts to combine the cosmopolitan and the national had by then begun to take on grotesque proportions. The tensions and contradictions in the term cosmopolitanism developed in new directions in the mass migration societies of the second half of the 20th century, with a focus on the practices rather than the idea of the concept. Self-imaginations of being a cosmopolitan city, for instance, referred in the 1990s to world openness and tolerance, exotic way of life in these cities, and intermingling of many nationalities and races under cultural adjustment. Being a cosmopolite noted in the same vein better off intellectuals or businessmen moving independently all over the world without restricting ties, exploring, exploiting, and explaining it. Multiculturalism emerged in the 1990s as a concept to reinforce the cosmopolitan imagery, which after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War became a core dimension of the new neoliberal globalization narrative based on the vision of the unbounded global market. However, quote, multicultural, end quote, came in the 2000s ever more to connote the opposite of cosmopolitanism: immigrant ghettos, marginalization, exclusion, and poverty. In many big European cities today, 1/3 or more of the inhabitants are immigrants of non-European origin. In the 1990s, the binary language of cosmopolitan and multicultural escaped the social question. From the 2000s onward, the term multicultural came ever more to draw attention to this escape and shifted to become a negative counter-concept of cosmopolitan. The negative connotation affected also the term cosmopolitan in the negative direction of socially irresponsible economic elites. The social question and the attempts to circumvent the social question was the catalyst in this conceptual transformation in the 2010s. Global history or world history. The journal World History since 1990, the competing journal Global History since 2006, as well as a growing number of edited volumes, monographs, and journal articles testified to the new historiographic trend after the end of the Cold War to analyze history in its global context with ambitions to transcend methodological nationalism, which ever since the 19th century had been the standard approach in the discipline. Since Kant, world history was synonymous with universal history, which in the 19th century discourse began to interpret the world as a process towards ever higher stages of development driven by some intrinsic logic. Europe was the origin, the standard of the goals of this process. The European nation-states became the carriers of the universal. At the latest, with World War II, this narrative became problematic. However, substantially it continued in the 1950s and 1960s. Under the name of modernization, and from the 1990s to the change of name to globalization. When globalization became a catchword, quote, world history, end quote, lost profile. Its connection to universal history proceeding through some kind of natural law got lost, and it began to connote a generally thematically unspecific interest in the past of the world. World history was in the 1990s more or less a curiosity in events and facts about the past and the non-Western world without any particular efforts to organize them in an overall narrative. The term global history took over as an instrument to establish that global pattern of past coherence. The language of the economists and sociologists who began to talk about the global village and globalization got its historical underpinning. Here is not the place to go deeper into this transformation, which occurred in the framework of a major semantic shift in social sciences after 1990, government to governance, state to market, hierarchy to network, etc. There is in this outline of global history an echo of the economistic globalization narrative about the evolution of global markets, which in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, rapidly appropriated a hegemonic priority of interpretation. Global history underpinned the new emerging master narrative through the argument that the globalization was much older than the 1990s. Global history gave the globalization narrative a historical dimension. Global history was in this outline version 2.0 of Hegel's and Marx's project below, where history itself became the main agent of change. The growing references to global history or world history after 1990 hardly meant a general agreement on the substance of the terms or its distinction from world history. Many did not see any difference at all. For some, global history was a demarcation to the historical ballast of world history, connoting universal history where Europe represented the universal. For many, the globalization narrative, against the backdrop of the digital revolution, with its unknown possibilities of new kinds of knowledge production and the collapse of the Soviet Union, with its promises of a new world, just meant a growing interest in the world beyond Europe, based on the insight that Europe/the West and its nation-states was too narrow a viewpoint. These insights did not necessarily assume a universal master plan, quote, globalization, end quote, but often on curiosity and to various parts and aspects of the world, often on curiosity as to various parts and aspects of the world beyond the West. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. Sitting in the kitchen, and I think my mother and father might be coming home soon, and it'll be a big old ruckus. So I've retreated into my bedroom to avoid contaminating their ears with my annoying voice. Turn off this goddamn speakers. The globalization language rapidly lost legitimizing power after September 2008, when the global financial markets crashed. The ever more evident problem of the globalization language is its teleology, which confirms imaginations of a Western standard where everything is measured in terms of progressive or backward. The globalization narrative is the updated version of the modernization narrative that emerged in the 1950s. The Western economic performance and road to modernity is the point of reference for the rest of the world. The challenge of global and world history is to confront this bias and develop a truly global perspective through micro as well as macro historical inquiries. The argument here is that a new world history must have a much more polycentric approach than just a matter of Europe or the West and the rest. Eurasian or Eurafrican entanglements rather than comparisons are important in a new kind of world history, but we should not forget about Sino-Japanese transfers in both directions, independent of Europe, or complex Euro-Indian African or Asian African interrelationships and mutual influences. The crucial question is how to relativize the European or Western view. Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his post-colonial critique, reflects on this question. It is easy to agree with Chakrabarty's view that colonialism produced a world image where it became, quote, normal, end quote, to think of England as a rich country and India as a poor country. Although he recognizes the Enlightenment values as a European achievement for the world, and that no Indian history can be written without integrating the colonial experience, the key issue in provincializing Europe, book, Provincializing Europe, is to what extent a history that recognizes the Enlightenment heritage can merge with indigenous histories into a truly cosmopolitan narrative. This question must inform any world historical approach worth the name. An approach that both avoids universalizing tendencies from a Western point of departure and prevents empirical collapse into world history as anything that happened in the world in the past is key to a new kind of world history. Such a world history must look for perspectives where the study of the particular reflects more general patterns. It is probably empirically inductive rather than theoretically deductive in the work on heuristic frameworks. Cosmopolitanism, for instance, could in a new world history be approached through a focus on the encounters between diverse peoples, such as in the late 19th century when demands for recognition of, quote, common human rights, end quote, were made by Chinese colonists in Australia. As Chinese imperial subjects and Australian immigrants, they argued that their claims in the name of, quote, cosmopolitan friendship and sympathy, end quote, and the Confucian precept of, quote, reciprocity in opposition to emergent race-based nationalism, end quote, a formulation that draws on Ulf Hannert's distinction, cosmopolitans attempting to engage with the locals. Such a view confronts the dominant Eurocentric narrative of human rights that sees linear progression from the North Atlantic declarations of the, quote, rights of man, end quote, in the late 18th century to their extension following the Holocaust and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The focus is on the multi-causal origins of values like international human rights and complex political, cultural, and social contexts in which conceptions of human rights have emerged, and been deployed. Micro-studies of cosmopolitan cities in the world is another example of a fruitful field for the development of new approaches in world history. Their individuals and groups of different origins are mixed together, often most intensely among the socioeconomic disadvantaged, as opposed to cosmopolitan individuals whose level of sophistication, tolerance, and adaptability is usually associated with a privileged elite. Rather than trying to disentangle them in order to highlight the one or the other, one might look at the entanglement between them and develop a view on cosmopolitanism as a complex genealogy. In 18th and 19th century Istanbul, for instance, ideas about cosmopolitanism coming out of Enlightenment Europe intersected with cosmopolitan practices at the boundaries of Europe and the Muslim world, drawing new lines and boundaries of identity and difference, which at the end cleared the ground for new, exclusively European philosophical articulations of cosmopolitanism. The French merchants of 18th century Istanbul existed at the intersection between two worlds in transformation. Their lived, quote, vernacular, end quote, Eurasian cosmopolitanism became at the end estranged from the philosophical and intellectual development of Enlightenment cosmopolitanism, which came to be defined as both elite and exclusively European. Seen from Istanbul, the story of 18th century cosmopolitanism is that of neither cosmopolitanism's triumph nor cosmopolitanism's downfall, but of the gradual displacement and substitution of one version by another. More generally, a focus on borders and concepts like cosmopolitanism, argued to be borderless, would be a fruitful approach in a new world history, the making and unmaking of borders, social, political, and economic borders as supplements, and relativization of the obsession with ethnic and religious borders during recent decades. World history and cultural difference. In the 19th century, the terms culture and civilization were used for demarcation between us and them. There is no place here to go into the interesting differences between these two concepts, but they became, together with nation and class, key terms of demarcation. Culture and civilization were in particular key concepts in academic ethnology and anthropology. The concepts radiated European superiority. Against the backdrop of decolonization after World War II, critical anthropology and post-colonial studies operated with the term cultural relativism, where each culture or civilization should be analyzed and evaluated according to its own gauges. This attempt to find an exit out from the colonial power discourse proved to be elusive, however. The putative objective categories of knowledge which continued to be the norm of European academic reflection carried on the European Western hegemony. In particular, post-colonial studies criticized the conceptual apparatus of the Western cultural sciences, which used terms like modernity, modernization, religion, nation, democracy, and time conceptualizations of linear progress universally without questioning whether these categories were applicable in the non-Western world. The term religion, for instance, has since the 19th century emerged as a key term in the narratives on an Occidental Sonderweg in all its variety. The European project of modernity, as it emerged in the Enlightenment philosophy, proclaimed itself as the opposite pole of religion. The accomplished secularization, the domestication of religion was and is in this vein seen as an outstanding marker of the modern Europe. Non-European cultures were and are confronted with the Gretchenfrage, or how they then had and have it with religion, and this question was and is linked to the question of how modern they really were and are. The situation is fully visible in the ongoing master narrative on Islam. The post-colonial critique has rejected the use of universal concepts in the study of non-Western societies. Edward Said was a portal figure in the development of this critique with his work on Orientalism in 1978. On this point, it is interesting to listen to the Syrian scholar Aziz al-Azmeh, who opposes the postulation a priori of a principal cultural difference between European and non-European societies. Al-Azmeh argues here that the concept of, quote, postmodern obscurantism, end quote. He is one of the sharpest critics of an academic proceeding which particularizes and isolates the multiple phenomenon of one well-demarcated world religion called Islam. The instrument here thereby is the postulated instead of empirically demonstrated cohesion and unity of this religion, which is also called the Islamic world or the Islamic civilization, and its sharp demarcation to other civilizations which are less defined in religious terms. The postulation of cultural difference encloses and, quote, over-Islamizes the Islamic history. One could here ask why we use a religious category of analysis instead of geographical and historical. Chinese history is not called Buddhist history and Indian history not Hindu history. The distinction between European and Christian history is also clear since the 17th century. The method of over-Islamization is culturalistic and essentializing and has in that respect connections to racism, according to Al-Azmeh. A conclusion of the critical argument is that transcultural comparison must avoid the two pitfalls of universalism and particularism and integrate both dimensions. On the one hand, a generalizing perspective with general historical categories like the economic, the social, and the political, and with a view on similarities, a perspective which confronts postulates of demarcations between civilizations, and, on the other hand, an individualizing perspective, which critically reflects on the hegemonic genesis of world Western categories of classification and on the idea of an Occidental Sonderweg. I don't know what that means, what Sonderweg means. The issue of Eurocentrism is thus a crucial problem in any world history. The estimation of the possibilities and the necessity to respond to this problem varies a lot. Arif Dirlik, Arifdirlik, who, as a side note, wrote a history of anarchism in China, for instance, has argued that world historical outlooks need to be basically understood as privilege-centric perspectives of the past. The purported desire to develop multi-angled world historical versions cannot overcome this situation, since Eurocentrism can rather be described in terms of inclusiveness than exclusiveness. Expansive inclusion, one could add, where, quote, inclusion, end quote, gets a colonial dimension. According to Dirlik, the effort to fit different societies or regions into an overarching narrative is impossible with ranking and filling them according to allegedly universal standards. For example, world histories tend to operate with Western categories such as, quote, nation, quote, culture, quote, civilization, or religion, which are implicitly or explicitly presented as the subjects and not the products of history. The argument here is that the task of a new world history is to develop a more polycentric and less teleological perspective on the world in the past, and at the same time discern general patterns and avoid that the history collapses into everything that happened in the world in the past. Such a new world history must necessarily also be different than the 19th century writing about cosmopolitanism within the framework of what was called universal history. The connection between cosmopolitanism and universal history will be discussed in the next section. Kant and Hegel, Fichte and Smith, Darwin and Spencer. Immanuel Kant, in his idea for a universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, tried to reconcile the fact that human beings do not behave in a human way with the hopes of human progress. One cannot suppress a certain indignation, Kant stated, when one sees men's actions on the great world stage and finds, besides the wisdom that appears here and there among individuals, everything in the large woven together from folly, childish vanity, malice, and destructiveness. In the end, one does not know what to think of the human race, so conceited in its gifts. It was difficult to see any purpose in the chaos of individual human action. The task of the philosophers was to see if one could find a natural purpose in this, quote, idiotic course of things human, end quote. It remains strange, Kant argued, that earlier generations appear to carry through their toil some labor only for the sake of the latter, to prepare for them a foundation on which the latter generations could erect the higher edifice which was nature's goal. And that only the latest of the generations should have the good fortune to inhabit the building on which a long line of ancestors had unintentionally labored, without being permitted to partake of the fortune they had prepared. However puzzling it might be, this human condition was necessary in order to fulfill the assumption of mankind as a whole, as a, quote, class of rational beings, end quote, not as individuals but taken together. Each human being is bound to die with the species, while the species is immortal. Like a colony of bees, the metaphor was not Kant's. They developed their individual capacities to the long-term perfection of society, but died before they could enjoy the perfection. The means employed by nature to bring about the development of all the capacities of men exposed their antagonism in society. Fourth proposition. Kant referred to the social antagonism as the unsocial sociability, by which he meant the propensity to enter into society bound together with a mutual opposition which constantly threatened to break up the society. Human beings have an inclination to associate with others because in society they felt themselves to be more than individuals. Without the human unsociability based on individual selfishness, all talents would remain hidden, quote, unborn in an Arcadian shepherd's life with all its concord, contentment, and mutual affection, end quote. Fourth proposition. Men, quote, good-natured as the sheep they herd would hardly reach a higher worth than their beast, end quote. Thanks to nature, Kant said, for the incompatibility, for heartless competitive vanity, for the insatiable desire to possess and to rule. Without these features, all the excellent natural capacities of humanity would forever sleep undeveloped. Quote, man wishes concord, but nature knows better what is good for the race. She wills discord, end quote. Kant's problem of the unsocial unsociability was an echo of Hobbes's question about how to prevent civil war, but the solution went in another direction. The highest purpose of nature was attainable only in societies with the greatest freedom, meaning that there was mutual opposition among the members. In order to make each individual's freedom consistent with the freedom of others, a, quote, perfectly just civil constitution, end quote, was required. However, this was not sufficient, and on this point Kant played off his cosmopolitan argument, seventh proposition. A perfect civic constitution was dependent upon the problem of a lawful external relation among states. Quote, through war, through the taxing and never-ending accumulation of armament, through the want which any state even in peacetime must suffer internally, nature forces them to make at first inadequate and tentative steps. Finally, after devastations, revolutions, and even complete exhaustion, she brings them to that which reason could have told them at the beginning, and with far less sad experience, to wit, to step from the lawless condition of savages into a league of nations. In a league of nations, even the smallest state could expect security and justice, not from its own power and by its own decrees, but only from this great league of nations, end quote. At the end, war itself would be seen not only as artificial and uncertain in outcome for both sides, together with the painful after effects in the form of an ever-growing war debt, quote, a new invention, end quote, Kant noted, that could not be met. The result would be that war disappeared. The impact of any revolution on all states in Europe so closely knit together through commerce would be so obvious that the other states, driven by their own danger without any legal basis, would offer themselves as arbiters and prepare the way for a distant international government without precedents in world history. Although Kant's world government, in his own words, existed only as a rough outline, it gave hope that, quote, finally, after many reformative revolutions, a universal cosmopolitan condition, which nature has as her ultimate purpose, will come into being as the womb wherein all the original capacities of the human race can develop, end quote. However, there was a clear utopian dimension of this statement. When Kant talked about international law, for instance, he emphasized that it could only function under certain specific conditions. Such a condition was the existence of an international court of justice to which the governments were prepared to submit. There was no such ultimate instance of justice, and therefore the situation among the states was lawless and anarchical. Neither did Kant develop closer thoughts on how such an instance could be established. Kant was keen to emphasize that he did not build his scenario on the work of empirically oriented historians, but on philosophical speculation. Only philosophy could emancipate mankind. However, the point here is that he did not envisage his cosmopolitan order as separated from the states or transcending them in a unified world. His world government was a confederative body. Cosmopolitanism went hand in hand with national solidarity and republican virtues at the state level. Cosmopolitanism was not an alternative but a final goal within, not without, the existing constitutional states. Another German philosopher, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, cemented the founding stone of Kant in a European cosmopolitan genealogy with a somewhat different terminology. Reason as opposed to nature, Weltgeschichte, world history instead of Universalgeschichte, I think it's, yeah. And with a more, which would be universal history, with a more developed philosophy of history, with a major role for the states and peoples as the prime movers of world history. The states were not eternal, but like human beings, they had a rise, a time of prosperity, and a decline. From a world historical viewpoint, one particular state or people's spirit, Volksgeist, in each historical moment, constituted the link in the chain of world history as the carrier of reason, Weltgeist. World history was the history of the states in terms of progressiveness. The relevant states were distinguished through the degree of consciousness about freedom. The realization of freedom was the purpose of the states and of world history. The undulating pattern of rise and decline of the individual cultures, and at the same time progression towards ever higher states of civilization, for the world as a totality moved from the east towards the west, beginning with the Oriental despotism and proceeding via Greek democracy and Roman aristocracy towards Christian European monarchies. These four realms constituted the junctions in the motion of history toward ever higher stages of freedom and rule of reason in the philosophy of Hegel. The constellation of states in each conjuncture was based on their sovereignty, i.e., on their independence from each other. The recognition of the sovereignty of another state as well as the conclusion and keeping of treaties depended on the sovereign state itself. There was, as opposed to the relations between individuals within a state, no imperative world legal authority superior to the states. World history alone was the world court of justice. This was a simplistic answer to Kant's problem and even more utopian. Hegel's teleology was more pronounced than Kant's. His view contained an idea of the end of history, and this did not mean a situation where nothing will ever happen again or that there will not be any political turmoil anymore. The end of history meant that history had reached its predestined goal. Hegel theorized this idea by describing the constitution of a social order which guarantees full liberty to everyone. This order was liberal democracy. Karl Marx later took up this idea and elaborated upon it, although for him the end goal was not liberal democracy, the democratic abstraction as he called it, but the socialist society without classes. Hegel's idea about the end of history came, as we know, back in the early 1990s after the end of the Cold War, although the content of a much-debated book disseminating this message was much more nuanced than the title, End of History, suggests. End of History by Francis Fukuyama. Another German early 19th century philosopher, wrestling with the connections between cosmopolitanism and the national, was Johann Gottlieb Fichte. A point of departure when he, after the Napoleonic occupation of the German-speaking territories, tried to mobilize a German nation, was tolerance and respect of other nations. The nation emerged through education, which would unify all citizens of a state and at the end, all citizens of the world without the abolishment of the national borders and specific characteristics. On this basis, he condemned Napoleon, whose unilateral domination of all other peoples resulted in the destruction of any germ of the human in humanity. Fichte's immediate agenda was to create a German nation that did not yet exist and to use Napoleon as a pivot in this undertaking. However, Fichte wanted to see the German nation in a long-term harmonious world order. The merger of all nations into a world republic would lead to the emergence of a republic of the nations, where the relationships between the nations would correspond to those between the citizens in a nation-state based on the rule of law. However, the concepts of cosmopolitanism and Weltbürgertum did not play a central role in Fichte's work. Fichte refers to Weltbürgerrecht in the vein of Kant as an international law which the states ruled by republican constitutions submitted to. Fichte restricted this law to the guarantee of universal hospitality, i.e., the free movement of persons under condition of submission to the rules of law in the foreign states. More important is his view on cosmopolitanism as a personal ethical attitude where the individual citizen regarded him or herself not only as a citizen of a nation, but also as a citizen of a world order which in a political sense did not yet exist. The cosmopolite behaves open to the world, is hospitable, travels and learns foreign languages. He or she feels at home in the world and does not develop any discriminating national pride. This individual pursues the general goal of humanity to promote human dignity. With a point of departure in this cosmopolitan view, Fichte developed in Der Patriotismus und sein Gegenteil, written from 1806 to 1807, the connection between patriotism and cosmopolitanism. Fichte did not see these two categories as opposite. Patriotism was just a dimension of cosmopolitanism. The cosmopolite could, despite a world-open mentality, only act in her or his near context and therefore, in practice, had to restrict patriotism to the nation. Cosmopolitan seems to have been more of a normative dimension and a long-term final goal. The hidden assumption of this view was that the nations and the humans pursue the same goals and by doing so do not create any conflicts. Adam Smith's cosmopolitanism did not emphasize the role of reason as much as the German philosophers in his analysis of the preconditions of cosmopolitanism. Adam Smith's ideal of a world community was not based on the common possession of reason and the beneficent workings of sympathy, but on mutual enablement and the desire for and satisfaction of an exponentially growing material enrichment. Trade and division of labor would preclude conflict and territorial rivalry. Patriotism would not disappear, but would be domesticated by a pacific desire for enrichment by means of trade rather than conquest. Fierce nationalistic sentiments and intense alliances between security allies would become increasingly less important than the rapidly proliferating forms of amicable strangership necessary for commercial cosmopolitanism. However, cosmopolitanism based on free trade was as little as in the German debate thought of as a substitute of the nations. The title of Adam Smith's main work is The Wealth of Nations. Cosmopolitan ideals went hand in hand with the imagination of the nation. Before Napoleon, there was a transnational dimension of the conceptualization of the world order, although it never transcended the states. It was obvious in the British debates on commerce and free trade and in Kant's writings. However, there were differences between the British and moral philosophers and political economists and Kant, who emphasized the role of reason and looked down on commerce that only fostered selfishness. The transnational dimension was also visible in the French Enlightenment debate, for instance in Voltaire's Essai sur les Mœurs from 1753 to 56. This work included material on French colonies in America, the Jesuits in South America, the Anabaptists, the treatment of captured Christians by the Moors, and comparable material. Napoleon triggered the German liberation wars in Fichte's, Hegel's, and others' outlines of a new interpretive framework of universal history as a progression from east to west, from despotism to democracy and monarchy, with a kind of culmination in the German nation. The project of universal history ended as German history. In British discourses since the 1860s, the decade when the German unification project left the imageries of the philosophers and became martial conquest politics directed by Bismarck, the universal was ever more conceptualized in a framework where the theories of Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer were the main points of reference. The humans were seen as a species under evolutionary adjustment or in a continuous fight for survival. This language with a clear universal dimension, but hardly universal in the sense of cosmopolitan, had a tremendous impact all over Europe. In particular, the imagined fight for survival became the heuristic point of departure for growing rivalry and conflict among nations. Through social Darwinism, which more properly should be called social Spencerism, since it was Spencer who talked about fight for survival, whereas Darwin referred to evolution through adaptation, national populations were mobilized for competition on world markets with other national populations. Colonialism and imperialism underpin this development, where the key actors not seldom hypocritically made use of the term civilization and the imagination of a civilizing mission, a, quote, white man's burden, end quote. Kipling. The Spencerian language went hand in hand with a parallel paradigmatic shift in political economy. The language of free trade had played a major role in cosmopolitan thoughts, drawing on the idea of global distribution of labor and commerce since Adam Smith. However, the rhetoric often ignored the theoretical limitation and precondition emphasized by Smith, the precondition of everything equal as a basis for perfect competition on which the whole model rested. The problem was that, quote, everything equal, end quote, never existed. Therefore, the free trade rhetoric and its reference to cosmopolitan ideas was seldom or never implemented in political practice. Only during a very brief period in the wake of the British anti-corn laws in 1846, the Anti-Corn Law League, founded in 1838, steps were taken in the direction of international free trade through the use of most favored national clauses. But the system was far from universal when the cracks of the facade became visible at the end of the 1860s. A few years later, the rhetoric collapsed in the wake of the lengthy international economic stagnation from 1873 due to hardening competition and deflationary pressures on wages and profits. In a few years, protectionism became the new key word, which reinforced national borders and played down the role of transnational movements. Towards a cosmopolitanism without a European centrism. Cosmopolitanism as a concept for the 21st century must obviously go beyond its historical European focus if it is going to have any viability. Interesting steps are being taken in this direction. One resource to draw on would be post-colonial theories, which is Rochona Majumdar recently and convincingly has demonstrated is not the same as binary confrontation between colonialism and anti-colonialism, but the layout of a more fluid pattern of encounters overlapping as mutual benefits as much as oppositions and exploitations. Colonizers and colonized were and are entangled in complex and often contradictory patterns. 19th century European imperialism was far from a seamless continuation of 18th century Enlightenment philosophy. The West is not a cohesive entity driven only by colonialist motives. The historical experiences of the colonies are more than just exploitation. Having said this, it is important not to forget the social dimension of the relations between centers and peripheries. One example of new genealogies for cosmopolitan thinking, by urging that these histories be sought only in the past of the West is Sheldon Pollock. He charts new ways of thinking in his work on the Sanskrit cosmopolis, whose circulating networks covered vast swaths of the world from Central Asia to the South China Sea. He refers to linguistic cosmopolitanism as, quote, literary communication that travels far, indeed without obstruction from any boundaries, and more important, that thinks of itself as unbounded, unobstructed, end quote. The fact that the lower classes of non-Europeans in European cities are referred to as multicultural provokes critical questions. The question is whether, quote, from colonialism to post-colonialism, end quote, with the emergence of the language of multiculturalism does not, as a matter of fact, mean the transformation of one version of colonialism to another, where the new version takes shape in the immigrant ghettos at the core of Europe and other, quote, Western, end quote, societies. Cosmopolitan representatives of a global order based on the financing and banking industry who are truly transcending national and cultural borders displace the social issue from a matter of human dignity and rights to a local problem of multiculturalism. The term emerged, as we saw in the 1990s, as part of the globalization semantics as an argument for letting various immigrant communities develop their own cultures free from interventions by host states, but also in crucial respects excluded from social welfare schemes. Less integration politics, as it had been established in the 1960s and 1970s, also less cost and appeal to governments and under financial pressures. Less cost in the short run, one might add. The social question is still at the core of the cosmopolitan dilemma, as it was during the 19th century construction of the nation-states. The fact that the dilemmas The social question is still at the core of the cosmopolitan dilemma, as it was during the 19th century construction of the nation-states. The fact that the dilemma is labeled multiculturalism does not change this fact. The social question recurred after 2000 in the wake of the erosion of the political capacity to manage global flows of capital, commodities, and labor. The flows were connected under strong mutual tensions. The language of ethnic nationalism that plays off native residents against immigrants confronted cosmopolitanism and became explosive. Populism and authoritarianism began to threaten what was believed to be stable democracies having overcome historical vices. Cosmopolitanism was, in the 18th and early 19th century, seen as a concept in a rather unproblematic way linked to nationalism. By the end of the 19th century, it had become a counter-concept to nationalism, although authors like Meinecke did what they could to keep them together. The term has in recent years begun to connote an ever greater revolt by the elites against the low culture of the masses, stuck in local experiences without perspectives or horizons. On this point exactly, the social issue is at stake. Cosmopolitanism is by many suspected of escaping or circumventing the bounded social problems in the wake of transnational financial operations. Cosmopolitanism is suspected of fleeing social responsibility. There is a historical irony here, since cosmopolitanism used to be an insult used by the national establishments against the international working class, meaning more or less Vaterlandslose, Gesellen, whereas it was a label to be proud of in the early working class language before the movement had been nationalized in 1914. In the Soviet language, cosmopolite was an honorary concept. Not for long. This is hardly a point of departure for a reconstruction of the term today. However, an integration of the social question in the concept would be important in order to give viability and mobilizing capacity to the term cosmopolitanism. As a very viable concept, cosmopolitan would have to respond to the question that the term multicultural provokes. Etymologically, cosmopolitan and multicultural are in many respects overlapping concepts, but in social practices over the last decades they have become counter-concepts. The problem is how to unify them. The solution to this problem deals with the social issue. What set out at the end of the 18th century as a problem of how to unify the cosmopolitan and national has become a problem of how to unify the cosmopolitan and the social. The problem of the genealogy of the concept of cosmopolitan is, from a world historical perspective, not only its failure to address the social question, however, but also its European centrism. One could argue that this problem has been solved by the fact that the cosmopolites of today all follow a Western pattern of behavior in their jet setting across the world, irrespectively whether they come from rich countries or poor. However, this is an argument that locks out the social question. A sustainable reconstruction of cosmopolitanism must much more integrate global social protest and activist movements for environment, health, and a fair distribution of wealth, like ATTAC, Social Forum, Doctors Without Borders, etc. Etienne Balibar has, in this vein, remarked that what truly unified the planet was not just colonial expansion, but the revolts, the liberation struggles that put into question the notion of, quote, different natures, end quote, that separate peoples from the, quote, metropole, end quote, from those of the colonies, producing a dialectic between these two demographic groups that results in a reversal of roles, a, quote, particularizing, end quote, of the old metropolis, and a, quote, universalization, end quote, of the former colonies. By universalization of the former colonies, Balibar refers to the large invisible presence in contemporary Europe of groups from the ex-colonies, for the unifying role of social protest. Balibar refers to the large invisible presence in contemporary Europe of groups from the ex-colonies. Balibar contributes to give the term cosmopolitan, the social dimension that it has been lacking from the beginning, and therefore made it fail as a viable alternative to nationalism. 20 years of hegemonic globalization rhetoric has made this task of integrating the social more difficult, but not less urgent. Thanks for listening.